May 24, 1941. 5:52 hours. North Atlantic, 300 nautical miles west of Brest. The icy wind tore across the wooden deck of HMS Hood as spotters on the forward platform scanned the grey horizon with binoculars frozen stiff by ocean spray. Then, contact. On the southern edge of the Denmark Strait, two shapes emerged from the early morning mist. Not mere shadows, but monsters. The German battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Massive, proud, and deadly. Within minutes, the Royal Navy would engage in one of the most tragic and consequential duels in naval history. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland stood silently on the bridge of HMS Hood, Britain's largest and most revered battlecruiser, scanning the enemy line through his binoculars. He gave no dramatic speech, no grand orders, just a calm, open fire when ready. At precisely 5:53, HMS Hood unleashed her first salvo toward Bismarck, followed seconds later by HMS Prince of Wales. The guns of the British Empire had spoken. But across the ocean, aboard the Bismarck, Admiral Gunther Lütjens and Captain Ernst Lindemann remained coldly professional. They were executing Operation Rheinübung, a mission to break into the Atlantic, disrupt Allied convoys, and inflict economic havoc. Bismarck, the pride of Nazi Germany, was fresh from the shipyards of Blohm and Voss, bristling with 8x 15-inch SKC, 34 guns, 12-inch thick belt armor, radar fire control systems, and a speed of over 30 knots. She was considered unsinkable. A floating fortress, engineered to challenge British naval supremacy. But Britain was watching. The moment Bismarck and Prinz Eugen slipped past Norway, the Admiralty scrambled everything. Dozens of ships. Aircraft carriers. Submarines. Spotter planes. A net cast wide across the Atlantic. The British knew that letting Bismarck reach the convoy lanes was a death sentence for their war effort. The encounter in the Denmark Strait was supposed to be a quick kill for the Royal Navy. But it became a nightmare. Just minutes into the battle, Prinz Eugen struck HMS Hood amidships with an 8-inch shell, igniting ammunition stores. Moments later, one of Bismarck's 15-inch shells hit the Hood's deck armor near the aft magazines. The explosion that followed tore the Hood in half. Within seconds, the pride of the Royal Navy was gone, broken in two. Of the 1,418 crew aboard, only 3 survived. The loss shocked the nation. The Royal Navy, undefeated since Trafalgar, had lost its most symbolic ship in a matter of minutes. On board the Prince of Wales, sailors watched in horror as Hood vanished in a plume of fire and smoke. But there was no time to mourn. They were still engaged, and Bismarck was turning her guns on them. The Prince of Wales, a new ship still dealing with mechanical issues, took multiple hits, bridge destroyed, guns malfunctioning, but she fired back. One of her shells struck Bismarck below the waterline near the bow, damaging a fuel tank. Though the hit didn't slow her down immediately, it began a slow bleed. A wound that would cost her dearly. As Prince of Wales withdrew under smoke cover, the damaged Bismarck turned south toward France, aiming to reach the safety of Luftwaffe air cover in occupied territory. But Lütjens made a crucial decision. He detached Prinz Eugen to continue raiding merchant ships while Bismarck limped alone toward Brest. That moment, the separation, turned a tactical victory into a strategic mistake. British intelligence intercepted Bismarck's radio transmissions. They knew where she was going. Now, it was a hunt. The British Admiralty activated every available asset. Ships from Scapa Flow. Submarines near Brest. Aircraft from Ark Royal. They issued a simple order: sink the Bismarck. On the evening of May 24, as Bismarck steamed south alone, wounded but still lethal, she was shadowed by British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk, using radar to track her from just over the horizon. Bismarck attempted evasive maneuvers, but the radar couldn't be shaken. She could outrun the cruisers, but not hide. And then, disaster struck for the Germans again. Just after midnight on May 25, Bismarck's rudder jammed during a violent turn. Whether from mechanical failure or damage from Prince of Wales, her steering was now compromised. She began to circle slowly in the open sea. A sitting duck. But for hours, the British didn't know this. Poor communications between shadowing ships and the Admiralty meant they briefly lost track of her. For a short time, it seemed like Bismarck might escape. Then, on the afternoon of May 26, a Catalina flying boat from Coastal Command spotted her again, still limping, still trying to reach France. But by now, Force H had arrived from Gibraltar, including the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and the old battlecruiser HMS Renown. The window to strike was closing. The Royal Navy had just one chance left. The Ark Royal launched her Swordfish torpedo bombers. These slow, fabric-covered biplanes were an anachronism, seemingly laughable against a state-of-the-art battleship. But what they lacked in speed, they made up for in precision and bravery. Flying low in the spray and wind, the Swordfish pilots braved anti-aircraft fire from Bismarck's 105mm flak batteries. One torpedo missed. Another hit her starboard side. But one torpedo struck her stern, and jammed her rudder completely. Bismarck could now only steam in circles. The most powerful warship afloat, helpless. The sea had turned against her. The Royal Navy closed in overnight. Battleships King George V and Rodney, along with cruisers and destroyers, took position. At dawn on May 27, the final act began. The British opened fire at 8:47. Bismarck responded, her shells landing dangerously close at first. But within minutes, repeated hits from 14-inch and 16-inch shells silenced her turrets. Rodney fired torpedoes at point-blank range, an unheard-of action for a battleship. The Bismarck was being torn apart. At 10:39, her guns silent, her superstructure mangled, and her hull burning, the German crew began scuttling the ship. Explosive charges were detonated below deck to prevent capture. At 10:40, she began to list. Moments later, she rolled over and sank beneath the Atlantic waves. Of the over 2,200 men aboard Bismarck, only 114 were rescued by British and German vessels before a U-boat threat forced the British to withdraw. The rest went down with her. The man who had claimed the Hood now lay beneath the same ocean. The Atlantic, once a theater of bold German aggression, was now their graveyard. The Royal Navy had taken a heavy loss, but had made their point. No warship, no matter how modern, no matter how mighty, was unsinkable. Not under the guns of an empire determined to survive. The sea doesn't honor arrogance. It only remembers who controls it. And after that day, the North Atlantic belonged once again to Britain. The smoke still hung low over the Atlantic as the surviving ships of the British task force turned for home. On the decks of HMS King George V, sailors moved quietly among spent shell casings, their faces smeared with soot and salt. No one cheered. No one sang. The destruction of the Bismarck had been necessary, but it hadn't felt like triumph. The sea around them was a floating grave, littered with wreckage and oil. Men had watched others die within sight of their own hands, and though their enemy had sunk, the cost of victory was written in every empty bunk aboard the fleet. Admiral Sir John Tovey stood silently in his bridge, staring into the grey horizon. The Royal Navy had fulfilled its promise to the British people, to avenge the loss of HMS Hood, but he knew what few dared to say aloud, that this victory was as much a warning as it was a statement of power. The age of the great battleships was ending. The Bismarck had been a masterpiece of steel and design, and yet she had fallen not to another titan of the sea, but to small, fragile biplanes made of canvas and courage. Swordfish torpedo bombers, flying through rain and tracer fire, had accomplished what shells and broadsides could not. They had rendered the unsinkable ship helpless. That realization haunted Tovey as the fleet made its slow, deliberate turn northward. The British Empire had built its dominance on ships like the Hood, the Prince of Wales, the King George V, giant war machines meant to rule the waves. But the Bismarck's demise revealed something new. Wars were no longer won by size, but by reach, by eyes in the sky, and by precision. The same airpower that crippled Bismarck would soon decide the fate of entire nations. The Battle of the Atlantic was evolving, and the Royal Navy knew it. In London, word of the Bismarck's sinking spread like wildfire. For days the British public had waited in tense silence as newspapers reported the chase. The loss of the Hood had been a national wound. When the Admiralty finally announced that Bismarck was sunk, church bells rang across the country. Civilians cheered in the streets. Radio announcers spoke with tears in their voices. Britain had been blooded, but not beaten. The Navy had avenged its fallen. Winston Churchill, who had personally followed every update during the chase, was said to have paced the war room for 2 days without rest. When he received the final report, he simply said, "Thank God." But behind the relief was fear. The Bismarck had shown what modern naval warfare looked like: fast, mechanized, lethal. A single ship, operating alone, had forced an empire to mobilize almost everything it had. The Royal Navy had committed 8 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, 21 destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft to bring her down. One ship. The math was staggering. And for Germany, the loss was devastating. Bismarck had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, the vessel meant to challenge British supremacy at sea. Its destruction was not just military, it was psychological. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels tried to control the story, issuing propaganda that the ship had gone down after a glorious fight. But even within the German High Command, morale plummeted. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, understood immediately what it meant. Germany would never again risk a major surface fleet operation in the Atlantic. The age of the surface raiders, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Graf Spee, was over. From then on, Hitler's navy would fight its war beneath the waves. The U-boat campaign intensified. Packs of submarines began haunting the convoy routes, turning the North Atlantic into a hunting ground. Yet even there, the echoes of Bismarck's death could be felt. Every convoy that reached Britain carried with it the memory of that chase, the desperate need to control the sea at any cost. For the British sailors who had fought that battle, the memory of Bismarck would linger forever. They spoke of the strange beauty of it, the flashes of the German guns in the dawn fog, the sound of shells passing overhead like express trains, the moment when the ship finally rolled and slipped beneath the sea. Some called it justice. Others called it mercy. Captain Vian of HMS Cossack, who had rescued many of the survivors, later recalled seeing a young German sailor clinging to a piece of wreckage, crying for his mother in the freezing water. "You couldn't hate them anymore," he said. "They were boys, like ours." War had a way of stripping away the myth. The Royal Navy had sunk Hitler's mightiest ship, but in the process, they had seen the human cost of every shell fired and every cheer back home. Beneath the waves, the wreck of Bismarck became a tomb, a steel coffin resting under 3 miles of cold, crushing water. Her guns pointed silently upward, still as if waiting for the next order. Decades later, when the wreck was found by Dr. Robert Ballard in 1989, it was almost perfectly preserved, the scars of battle still visible across her hull. The bow was missing, torn away by the explosion of her own magazines. The superstructure was mangled, the deck guns frozen mid-reload. But there was something eerie about how intact she remained. Even after 48 years, she still looked powerful, defiant, and almost alive. As though the spirit of the ship refused to die. Ballard's expedition confirmed what survivors had long claimed, that it wasn't just British shells that sent her down. The Germans had scuttled her themselves, opening valves and setting charges to ensure that their enemy would never capture the wreck. Bismarck had been beaten, but she chose her own grave. In the years that followed, the sinking of Bismarck became legend. Songs were written, documentaries filmed, and ballads sung. "Sink the Bismarck" became a rallying cry for the Allied naval forces. But the men who were there rarely spoke of it with pride. For them, it was something heavier. The sea had swallowed thousands that morning, British and German alike, and left behind only the reminder that no ship, no matter how great, could escape the weight of history. The Bismarck was more than a warship. She was a symbol of ambition, of hubris, of the industrial power that turned men into numbers and ships into monuments. Her sinking marked not just the end of a chase, but the beginning of a new kind of war. One fought not for honor, but for survival. And as the North Atlantic calmed again, the wreck of the Bismarck lay beneath it all, cold, silent, and eternal, bearing witness to the night when steel met salt water, and the might of an empire was tested by the wrath of the sea. By early June 1941, the Royal Navy had returned to its patrols, and the echoes of Bismarck's final broadcast had long faded from the wireless sets of the Atlantic Fleet. But in the Admiralty war rooms of London, the lessons of her demise were still unfolding. Intelligence officers pored over battle logs, engineers studied the damage reports, and naval architects re-examined the armor layouts of British capital ships. Bismarck had not been invincible, but she had come dangerously close to outrunning history. For days, she had threatened to break into the Atlantic shipping lanes, and if not for that lucky hit to her rudder, she very well might have succeeded. That single torpedo, launched by an outdated biplane flying barely faster than a car, had altered the course of naval warfare. The Royal Navy now knew they could no longer rely solely on brute force and dreadnought dominance. Carrier-based aircraft were no longer a support element. They were central to strategy. It was the clearest signal yet that the era of battleships was ending. Just 2 years later, this evolution would be seen in full force as the war pivoted into the Pacific, where aircraft carriers became the tip of the spear. But in mid-1941, as Britain still stood largely alone against Hitler, the victory over Bismarck served a more urgent purpose. It reminded the world that the Royal Navy could still strike with speed and fury. Meanwhile, in Germany, the fallout was severe. Adolf Hitler, enraged by the loss of the Bismarck, lashed out at the Kriegsmarine leadership. He had already been skeptical of surface fleet investments, favoring instead the stealthy efficiency of the U-boats. The death of Bismarck confirmed his doubts. He ordered a dramatic shift. Surface ship construction was to be slowed or halted entirely. Battleships like Touted, Bismarck's sister ship, would be kept in port more as floating threats than active participants in the war. Hitler believed it was better to let them loom over Allied planning than risk them in open battle. The age of capital ship duels in the Atlantic had ended before it truly began. Germany would now focus on unrestricted submarine warfare. Thousands of tons of Allied shipping would vanish beneath the waves in the months that followed, targeted not by mighty turrets, but by silent predators. But Bismarck had already played her part in shaping Allied doctrine. The Royal Navy, aware of the vulnerability exposed by Hood's destruction, began reinforcing the decks of its remaining battlecruisers and fast battleships. More significantly, it tripled down on radar development. Bismarck had been tracked and shadowed largely due to advancements in shipborne radar. That technology would soon become standard, allowing even the darkest seas to be lit by invisible eyes. Beyond strategy, there was something else, something intangible, that the Bismarck episode awakened in both navies: reverence. Sailors spoke of her with awe, not as an enemy, but as a rival. Royal Navy veterans who'd engaged her didn't speak with hatred but with respect. She was a beautiful killer, one would later say. German survivors, too, remembered the British with a strange mix of bitterness and admiration. The destroyer HMS Hood, which pulled dozens of them from the sea, had done so even as other Allied ships turned away, wary of U-boat attack. "They saved us, though they didn't have to," a young German radioman recalled. "They were men like us. Just wearing different flags." The war would go on, more brutal than ever, but for a brief moment in the North Atlantic, there had been something else: honor amid horror. As for Touted, the ghost of her sister ship haunted her throughout her service. She spent most of her life hiding in the fjords of Norway, dodging British air raids and submarine attacks. Despite being the most heavily armed vessel in Europe, she barely saw open combat. British planners feared her deeply, devoting countless resources to tracking and eventually destroying her. But she was a prisoner of her own legacy. Bismarck had gone out in fire and fury. Touted remained behind like a caged beast, feared but never truly unleashed. It wasn't until 1944 that British Lancaster bombers, using 12,000-pound tall-boy bombs, finally cracked her armor and sank her in Troms. The battleship era had effectively closed. In the decades after the war, historians, naval engineers, and enthusiasts would revisit the Bismarck saga over and over again. Documentaries would dissect her armor schemes, books would speculate about whether she could have survived had her steering gear held out just a little longer, and myths would swirl about secret missions, sabotage, and shadowy orders. But the core of the story remained painfully clear: she was sent into the Atlantic with insufficient support, pursued relentlessly by a vengeful empire, and ultimately brought down by the combined weight of naval doctrine, air power, and grim resolve. Even today, Her wreck lies 2.5 miles beneath the surface, isolated and upright, her guns eerily in place. The cold, pressurized deep has preserved her almost like a monument. Explorers who visited describe the eerie silence, the rows of steel rivets, the mangled propellers, and the gaping hole where her bow once was. And on her deck, still faintly visible under layers of silt, are the scars of battle, the story etched in steel. To understand the Bismarck is to understand a turning point, not just in the war, but in the very nature of conflict at sea. She embodied the twilight of an era. The last thunder of battleship broadsides. The final charge of steel leviathans meeting in open ocean. Her sinking didn't just mark a British victory. It signaled the end of a philosophy that had dominated naval thought for half a century. And it reminded the world that even the greatest weapons of war, forged in pride and shrouded in invincibility, can still be outflanked by humility, coordination, and the will to adapt. The Royal Navy, battered but unbroken, would go on to play a critical role in the remainder of the war, escorting convoys, battling U-boats, and preparing for D-Day. And for those who had been there on that fateful morning in May 1941, watching the Atlantic swallow the mightiest ship Germany had ever built, the lesson was burned deep into memory: no ship is truly unsinkable. Not against the sea. Not against fate. Not against the combined fury of a nation fighting for survival. By the summer of 1941, the ripples from the Bismarck's demise were already reshaping naval command structures across the Allied and Axis powers. Inside the Royal Navy, the sinking was dissected in war colleges, strategy rooms, and debriefings with an urgency rarely seen. Not just because of the loss of HMS Hood, but because Bismarck had exposed the fragile underbelly of traditional surface fleet doctrine. A single German ship had nearly broken through the Atlantic cordon, and in doing so, forced Britain to lay bare nearly its entire fleet just to stop her. The vulnerability was clear. The Royal Navy could not afford to chase every fast surface raider with a swarm of ships. If another Bismarck-class vessel slipped through, there was no guarantee a second chase would end in success. But the Germans had no intention of repeating the operation. Grand Admiral Raeder, once a champion of capital ships, was quietly pushed aside. His prestige diminished after the disaster. Raeder's influence waned while Admiral Dönitz, architect of the U-boat Wolfpack strategy, gained Hitler's favor. For the Führer, Bismarck's destruction had proven what he had long suspected: big ships were big targets. Submarines, he believed, were cheaper, stealthier, and far more effective. Under Dönitz's command, the Kriegsmarine shifted decisively beneath the waves. Thousands of tons of Allied shipping would vanish in the coming months, and the Battle of the Atlantic would soon enter its deadliest phase. And yet, even in defeat, Bismarck remained a symbol of national pride in Germany. Propaganda posters still depicted her cutting through stormy seas, guns raised, the Reich's naval power embodied in one terrifying silhouette. Survivors were paraded for interviews, their words shaped by Goebbels' ministry to cast the sinking as heroic martyrdom. But within naval circles, the truth was acknowledged behind closed doors. There would be no further breakout attempts by battleships. Tirpitz, lurking in the Norwegian fjords, became a fleet in being, threatening by presence alone but never permitted to challenge fate the way her sister had. On the British side, the aftermath fostered a different kind of reckoning. While newspapers celebrated the victory, those within the Admiralty understood how close they had come to catastrophe. Had Bismarck's rudder not been jammed, had the Swordfish torpedo not struck true, had the weather shifted slightly, any of these variables could have changed the outcome. It wasn't British firepower that doomed the Bismarck. It was persistence, improvisation, and the unexpected effectiveness of air-launched torpedoes. The Royal Navy began accelerating its focus on aircraft carriers, commissioning new ones and refitting existing hulls for aviation. Where once a battleship had been the pride of any task force, now the carrier took center stage. The lessons of Bismarck would echo all the way to Midway and Taranto, where British and American forces used air superiority to cripple enemy fleets before they ever came into gun range. But beneath the strategic calculations, there remained a psychological legacy that neither side could ignore. Bismarck's story struck a deep emotional chord. In the British public's mind, she was the slayer of the Hood, a monster that had to be stopped at all costs. The fact that Britain had succeeded in hunting her down gave the people a sense of restored faith during one of the darkest phases of the war. France had fallen, the Luftwaffe bombed London nightly, and the Nazi war machine looked unstoppable. The sinking of Bismarck was more than a naval victory, it was symbolic defiance, proof that Britain could still strike back. In Germany, the Bismarck myth grew even as the strategic picture darkened. Some Germans believed the ship had not been sunk at all, that she had slipped away beneath the fog to fight another day. Wild rumors spread of her being repaired in secret, or of ghostly radio transmissions picked up from the deep Atlantic. Sailors aboard U-boats spoke of her in hushed tones, a kind of steel martyr sacrificed too soon. For Hitler, who had once declared Bismarck unsinkable, her loss was another betrayal in a growing list of military misfortunes he blamed on everyone but himself. As time passed, the war moved on. New battles replaced old ones. The Pacific roared to life with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Russia turned the tide at Stalingrad. The skies of Europe grew dark with American bombers. But for those who had served at sea, Bismarck remained a singular moment, a perfect storm of power, pride, and tragedy. Veterans who had faced her spoke of the fear she inspired, of the shock when her shells struck home, and of the surreal calm that followed her final plunge. In pubs and veteran halls across Britain, old sailors would fall silent when her name was mentioned. Not out of fear, but out of respect. By the war's end in 1945, battleships had become almost obsolete. The Yamato, the Musashi, even the mighty Tirpitz, all were sunk by air power. The age of surface dreadnoughts had ended not in a grand final battle, but in a series of one-sided air strikes and torpedo hits from planes they could barely see. The world had moved on. But the Bismarck's tale refused to fade. In 1989, when Dr. Robert Ballard finally located the wreck of the Bismarck, resting quietly over 15,000 feet below the surface, the world turned its attention back to that fateful week in 1941. The footage showed the ship upright, eerily intact despite the depth and pressure. Her superstructure was twisted, her guns silent, but her presence remained regal. Ballard's team noted the damage on her port side, the result of British shells, and the torn sections near the stern where scuttling charges had likely been detonated. It was clear she hadn't simply been blasted apart. She had been sunk deliberately by her own crew, choosing the deep over surrender. That discovery rekindled old debates. Was she truly sunk by the Royal Navy, or had the Germans denied them the final blow? In truth, it was both. The Royal Navy had crippled her, cornered her, and delivered blow after blow. But in the end, the German crew had ensured that no British boarding party would ever step foot aboard her. To this day, naval historians consider the sinking of the Bismarck a defining moment in 20th-century maritime warfare. Not just because of its scale, or the sheer number of vessels involved, but because it marked a philosophical shift. It was the last great pursuit of a battleship by battleships. Everything that followed, carrier battles, guided missiles, nuclear submarines, would be born from the lessons learned during that desperate chase across the Atlantic. And beneath the waves, Bismarck still lies, a monument to a vanished era. Cold. Silent. Undisturbed. The last of her kind. Though the Bismarck lay broken in the depths, her legacy only grew stronger as the decades unfolded. She had become more than a ship, she was now a legend wrapped in steel, myth, and memory. Naval architects studied her design for decades, fascinated by the blend of brute force and technical elegance. Her armor scheme, her high-speed profile, her fire control systems, they were all ahead of their time, and many modern warships would draw quiet inspiration from her silhouette, even as missiles replaced turrets and sonar replaced lookouts. But the truth is, Bismarck's greatest legacy wasn't in design. It was in doctrine. She had exposed, once and for all, the limits of surface warfare in a world that had already begun to rise into the skies. In the years immediately after the war, the Royal Navy and US Navy both decommissioned dozens of battleships. What had once been the pinnacle of naval power, these massive floating fortresses, were now seen as lumbering relics. The aircraft carrier, once an experimental tool, had proven itself as the decisive weapon in both oceans. Bismarck hadn't fallen to another battleship in a duel of equals. She had been hunted, worn down, and pinned by aircraft launched from a converted ocean liner with canvas wings. It was poetic in a way. The future had destroyed the past. Not in a glorious showdown, but through sheer adaptability. But history isn't always so clean. Among the crews who served on King George V, Rodney, and the destroyers that dared close within range of Bismarck's massive 15-inch guns, the story had no poetry. It had blood, smoke, and the terrible weight of duty. Many of those sailors lived with the memory of that battle for the rest of their lives. The scream of incoming shells. The way the ocean lit up with orange fire as Bismarck's secondary guns fired one last defiant volley. The silence that followed her death, a vast, hollow quiet that no celebration could fill. Because in war, even victory can taste like ash. In the aftermath, the Admiralty quietly reviewed its engagement strategy. The decision to send in battleships for the final kill was questioned by some. Could she have been blockaded and boarded? Could lives have been spared? But such questions rarely had satisfying answers in war. The Royal Navy had made its choice, to end the threat swiftly, with overwhelming force. And it had worked. Bismarck would never terrorize a convoy again. Yet the debate would linger, in the margins of official reports, in the footnotes of naval histories, and in the haunted eyes of those who had watched her vanish beneath the sea. The wreck itself became a sacred place. When Ballard's team explored it, they found no bodies, the sea had taken them long ago. But there were boots still lying on the deck, twisted ladders, melted deck plating from explosions, a snapshot frozen in time. The damage told its own story, heavy shell hits along the superstructure, the clear signs of internal scuttling charges, and the final collapse of the stern, torn off as she sank. No single hit had done her in. It had taken hours of punishment, and the will of her own crew, to bring her down. And still, even at the bottom of the ocean, Bismarck retained her dignity. Unlike other wrecks shattered into twisted ruins, she sat mostly upright, her massive hull resting gently on the seabed. Her guns, silenced forever, still pointed outward, as if daring anyone to approach. Divers who descended to her reported an eerie stillness. A sense of presence. One even claimed to feel like he was being watched. Rational or not, it was clear, Bismarck was not just a shipwreck. She was a grave. Back on land, she lived on in books, documentaries, war museums, and paintings. Model kits sold by the millions. Entire generations of young naval enthusiasts grew up building replicas of her in bedrooms and basements, their imaginations stirred by the epic tale of the Atlantic pursuit. Filmmakers recreated her final moments with orchestral flair and patriotic fervor, and historians debated the fine points of every engagement, the angle of torpedo strikes, the turning radius after the rudder jam, the exact time the scuttling charges were detonated. The debate wasn't just academic. It was emotional. Bismarck had become a symbol of technological triumph, strategic failure, and the human cost of pride. But the question that lingered more than any other was this: why did Germany send her out alone? In hindsight, the decision seems reckless. Bismarck was a masterpiece, but she was never meant to operate without air cover or escort. Her sister ship Tirpitz remained in port. No heavy cruisers flanked her once Prinz Eugen detached. The Luftwaffe had no means to protect her once she left the European coast. The result was inevitable: a lone battleship, however powerful, could not stand against the full weight of British sea and air power. Grand Admiral Raeder had pushed for the operation, hoping to break British morale and sever transatlantic supply lines. But in doing so, he'd gambled everything on a single mission. And he lost. From then on, Germany's surface fleet would wither. No new battleships were launched. Tirpitz was bombed in Norway and left to rust. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau met similar fates. And as Allied bombers blackened the skies and U-boats were driven deeper into the Atlantic, the Reich's dream of naval supremacy faded entirely. Hitler turned inward. The seas were lost. And so, Bismarck's story became not just a tale of war, but a cautionary epic of what happens when awe becomes arrogance. She was a marvel of steel, speed, and power. But she was also alone, misunderstood by her own high command, and unleashed too soon. In the end, it wasn't her guns that failed. It was her mission. Her purpose. Her place in a world that had already begun to move past her. Still, in the darkness of the deep Atlantic, her story waits. Not in triumph. Not in defeat. But in silence. The kind only the ocean understands. And that silence, cold, black, and absolute, became her final chapter. The Bismarck, once hailed as the embodiment of German naval supremacy, was now an underwater cathedral of steel and loss. There were no further transmissions. No more orders. No flags fluttering from her masts. Just riveted plates collapsing under pressure, and the occasional groan of shifting metal as the deep sea slowly claimed what war had left behind. Yet even there, 15,000 feet down, her presence endured. Every sonar ping, every grainy underwater photo, every hushed mention among veterans and historians kept her alive in ways few other warships could ever claim. She was unlike the Yamato, destroyed in a blaze of American carrier-based fury. Unlike the Tirpitz, bracketed in her fjord until British bombers dropped the sky on her. Bismarck died alone, far from land, surrounded not by fellow ships, but by ghosts, the ghost of the Hood, the shadow of the Atlantic, and the echo of decisions made by admirals and dictators who never stepped aboard her decks. The deep claimed her not just as a war machine, but as a monument to what naval warfare had been, and what it would never be again. In the years that followed, naval technology would transform beyond recognition. Guided missiles, nuclear propulsion, stealth hulls, digital targeting, all innovations born from a post-Bismarck world. No navy would ever again build a battleship like her. Not because they couldn't, but because they no longer needed to. The arms race had shifted to new dimensions: speed, detection, air dominance. And in those parameters, the Bismarck was a beautiful relic. A lion built for a battlefield that had already begun to vanish. And yet, her story endures because it transcends metal and fire. It's not just about displacement tonnage or the thickness of belt armor. It's about the drama of a singular chase, the way one ship could hold the attention of a global war. For 8 days, the entire world watched a deadly game of hide-and-seek unfold across the Atlantic. Naval officers and housewives, submarine crews, and radio operators, all fixated on the same question: where is the Bismarck? And will she be stopped? The answer would come not from a superior ship, but from collective pressure: aircraft, destroyers, cruisers, signals intelligence, chance weather patterns, and the grim determination of exhausted sailors. It was a joint effort, born not from one brilliant plan, but from resilience and sacrifice. Many of those who hunted her never lived to see her end. They fought blindly into storm-racked seas, torpedo alleys, and blackened skies, knowing only that this ship had to be stopped. Because if she wasn't, others would follow. And next time, they might not be so lucky. And what of her crew? Over 2,200 men went down with the Bismarck. Only 114 survived. Pulled from freezing seas by destroyers and cruisers in the final hours of the battle. Their stories are all that remain of life aboard that behemoth in her final hours. They spoke of water rising through the decks, of bulkheads glowing red from fire and concussion, of comrades helping each other into the sea as the tilt of the hull became unbearable. Some clung to flotsam for hours. Others slipped beneath the waves with no one to hear them. They were sailors, not symbols. Fathers, brothers, sons, caught in a war they did not begin, aboard a vessel destined to become legend. In the end, the Bismarck reminds us of a truth often buried beneath statistics and schematics, that every warship is a floating world, filled with human beings. With routines, arguments, letters from home, nicknames scratched into metal. And when that world is torn apart, it leaves behind more than wreckage. It leaves behind silence. One that echoes far beyond the sea floor. Today, the Bismarck lies within a protected maritime grave. Divers do not disturb her. No salvagers are allowed near. She is a war grave in the truest sense. A site not for conquest, but contemplation. For every historian who debates her tactical value, there's a veteran who remembers how the water boiled with flame. For every engineer who marvels at her construction, there's a survivor who remembers the deck slipping away beneath his boots. The ship may be gone, but the story lives on, because we choose to tell it. And that's why the night the Royal Navy sank Hitler's unsinkable battleship isn't just a footnote in the long chronicle of World War II. It's a turning point. A fable of steel and error, of bravery and obsession, of what happens when old empires meet new realities. The age of the battleship ended not in triumph, but in a slow, smoking spiral into the cold Atlantic deep. And at the center of it all, one name, whispered across the water, Bismarck. Her keel was laid in pride. Her launch was watched with awe. Her guns fired with fury. And her end came not from a single blow, but from the weight of inevitability. And still, even in silence, she dares us to remember. Remember how close she came to escaping. Remember how hard she was to kill. Remember that in war, there is no such thing as unsinkable.